Is it possible to be both a libertarian and a nationalist? Now, I've heard some people, libertarians, who claim that in order for one to be truly a libertarian, they must be an internationalist, a person who does not believe in national nation states. Essentially, that liberty exists wherever wherever the individuals decide liberty does exist. And this probably came to more of a boiling head the last couple of years when we had kind of our woke eruption in the party. And so I guess the question to understand, uh, can a libertarian be a nationalist? I'd say, well, the first answer to that would be, as an individual, can I make choices? Well, a libertarian would say yes. Well, if I can choose something, the question is it in itself uh, counterindicative to liberty? Is it something where the two can't exist together? Okay, good question. So we're going to do a little bit of looking at the words themselves and understand that I've come to a conclusion where I think it's possible to be a libertarian nationalist. I know one of the things that came up. I've been involved with the party. I started 1995, 1996 time frame. And probably one of the things that kind of threw me off initially was almost a sophomoric view that a lot of libertarians had of the United States as a country. And when I say sophomoric, okay, so the thing is no, obviously it's changed a lot because uh, children pretty much aren't being taught anything in schools. Uh, I spent a year as a substitute. I'll attest to that. But back in the days where they actually did attempt to teach things in schools, um, they were teaching a rather simplistic, nationalistic, patriotic history. And to kind of jokingly quote uh, Norm MacDonald, where he said, U.S. history books works out. We're a good guy every time. Uh, so obviously, it's a rose-colored version of history. Now, what ends up happening is if you go on to any kind of advanced history, uh, a lot of, especially college level history teachers, love debunking the nationalistic and patriotic versions of history. And in all honesty, if you look back in time, it was openly acknowledged that there were two different levels of history, one for the masses and one for the educated. So it wasn't really expected. The goal was to create a history that helped people uh, work within the country better to be part of the melting pot, etc. Now, I think you've reached the sophomoric level of history is when you start learning that the rose colored version isn't quite as pretty as it's laid out, that there are a lot of blemishes, a lot of problems, some things that were actually kind of horrific. Uh, there's a tendency to go, oh, well, the United States is the most horrible place on the world, on the planet then. Okay, well, that's not particularly nuanced. Uh, I think you get to a point if you really dig into the history and understand it, you realize that um, there's incredible amounts of nuance you need to understand the progression of history. understanding that some of the thought modes we take for granted today would have been absolutely impossible 50, 100, 150, 200 years ago. And one would hope that you know future historians will be a lot kinder to us than we've been to the people of our past, at least from the people who can't figure out the nuance of things. So, just a real quick look at definition of patriotism: love and devotion to one's country, love one's country, the passion which moves a person to serve his country, either in defending it from invasion or protecting its rights and maintaining its laws and institutions. Love of country, embodied or personified, patriots collectively. So, I know when you're kind of going through the whole mode of, oh, yes, I know everything about the history and, oh, the United States is awful, people assume that if you have a patriotic view of things, you must be part of the masses who don't know what they know. But I think it's possible to move on to a point where once you understand how to work the nuance in, saying, yeah, this country was not perfect. This country made horrible mistakes. This country uh, continues to make mistakes. But the thing you have to look at in the world of nuance is, if you're the one of the people saying this is a horrible place, the question is where's the better place? Or where was the better place back in history? Or if you're talking about particular periods where things are going badly here, where was it much better for other people elsewhere? And you're going to have a lot of trouble answering that question because there is a certain amount, and I hate to use the word because it has connotation beyond what people say, there's a certain amount of exceptionalism here. And I'm not one of those who believe it's divine exceptionalism. I believe it's just a fact, a matter of geography, a matter of historical currents, and a matter of the people who've settled this land has made it somewhat exceptional in that things are a little bit better here than elsewhere. Maybe recent years we can start questioning it. We may not like the way things are going the last decade or so, but again, it's hard to pick a place where you would rather be. And I know some expats who've headed off to greener pastures, but a lot of those uh, expat fun lands that they head off to retire to, a lot of them are actually dependent on the United States in order to be what they are. And that's something we'll get into in a little bit. So let's actually look at nationalism as a definition, because it is kind of important to understand that there are several aspects to it. Now, obviously, the first one is the one that most people throw in its negative light: devotion, especially excessive or undiscriminating devotion in the interests or culture of a particular nation state. And yeah, that kind of nationalism generally isn't good. Probably is all oh, it's hard to say always, but it probably comes very close to always being a bad thing. But let's look at the other definitions. The belief that nations will benefit from acting independently rather than collectively, emphasizing national rather than international goals. Well, I have a hard time seeing fault in that one. I really see that as being true. If I had a choice between the United States being an independent entity rather than being a collective entity, I believe being independent is far better. Item 3. the belief that a particular culture or ethnic group constitutes a distinct people deserving of political self-determination. Um, that's pretty hard to argue with, too. So, people who are saying a libertarian can't be a nationalist are ignoring uh, the definitions that come up in items 2 and 3 there, which are wholly valid. So let's tear into the history of it a bit to understand where it comes from. Now, nationalism isn't as old as a lot of people would assume. Uh, Essentially, the idea of gluing a people together within a particular boundary actually is something that came out of the French Revolution. Nearly all the isms come out of the French Revolution. And what was happening, if you looked at France, there were ethnic subgroups in France that considered themselves to be very distinct. They would call themselves by their ethnicities before they would call themselves a Frenchman. So one of the things that happens is the French Revolution kicks off. And I mean, obviously, there's a lot of badness in the French Revolution itself. But the question comes up is, does a country have a right to self-determination, even if it's making horrible mistakes? And in this case, pretty much all of Europe said no. When the French Revolution started getting wonkier, pretty much all of Europe declared war on France. And one of the tools the French came up with in order to thwart essentially the militarized world that was coming at them was the invention of nationalism. The idea of trying to get all these ethnicities and subcultures in the country to identify as a new superculture, French. And it was, in terms of creating self-defense for the nation, it was an astounding success. It was nationalism that allowed the French to essentially put barely trained soldiers, many of them not even armed with firearms, up in masses against the professional armies of Europe, and were able to thwart them at many instances. So nationalism was very beneficial to the French in this particular instance. Now, I mean, if you want to look at it in terms of, the outcomes of the French Revolution, it would almost seem it would have probably been better if the international armies had won. But in terms of the idea of protecting a French identity, it worked astoundingly well. I'd recommend a book called Bayonets of the Republic. Really puts it in good terms, explaining the impacts of it. So people recognized how valuable this nationalism was, and they would try to emulate it wherever they could. Some areas was a lot harder because when you had very multi-ethnic empires that really, their history didn't allow for assimilation because the different groups didn't like each other, nationalism was harder to implement. So if we look at the major historical issues that come up, like for instance, if we look at Napoleon, and what I'm doing is I'm asking a question here: is nationalism always a damnable thing? Is it always bad? And if you look at the case of Napoleon, for the most part, Europe was never going to allow him to be leader of France. Uh, it was pretty much always the other side initiating against him in terms of uh, basically accelerating the wars. The one point where Napoleon was the absolute aggressor was against Russia, and in that case, he was attempting to keep himself in power via essentially an economic embargo against Britain that Russia was no longer following his continental system. But I would say, arguably, at that point, and I could see where you might disagree, but Napoleon was a dictator acting in his own self-interest, and the nationalism was merely a tool he was using to that effect. The question is, if Britain had ever decided at any point where they said, we will let you rule in peace, would Napoleon had gone through with all his conquests? Difficult to say at this point. We may have had a natural progression of the continuing European wars where countries just fought each other and big peace conferences would be set up and people would shift borders here and there and marry different people into different families and get everything all straightened up. But the thing is because Britain was never ever going to let Napoleon sit on the throne of France, we can't say for a fact that Napoleon would have used nationalism as a weapon against the rest of Europe. In fact, in a lot of cases, rather than occupying or amalgamating countries into the empire, a lot of them were satellite states that had governments friendly to the French imperium imposed upon them. So if we jump forward and look at probably the two more famous cases of nationalism, fascism and Nazism. Now, both these countries were not just merely nationalist. And that's one of the big issues people have problems with, because if you only think of them as nationalists, then you say, well, that had to be the problem. But in fact, the Italian fascists were socialists. They were nationalists who were also socialists. In the terms of the Nazis, calling them nationalists is a little bit inaccurate. They were socialists who were also racialists, people who believed in a particular form of race theory. Now, if you look at both countries, their primary motivation for conducting wars against foreign nations actually didn't have anything to do with the nationalism. It had to do with the socialism. Both the roots of fascism and the roots of Nazism believed in the idea of the shrinking market theory. Something that's pretty much not true, but I guess it's still a theory somewhere. And the shrinking market theory believed that as a country industrialized, it would lose its ability to feed itself and produce the raw materials in order to feed its factories. And that ultimately, that if everything were allowed to industrialize, like every country in the world, eventually you get to this point where nobody could feed themselves because nobody would be able to import food from other places. So in the cases of both Italy and Germany, their belief in the shrinking market theory led them to believe that their only solution to make their socialism work was the conquest of areas that had the resources that they believed would help them advance themselves. So, and by the way, the socialism of that time period, not just fascist and Nazi socialism, but socialism in general, believed in the shrinking market theory. So the shrinking market theory uh, is an artifact of socialism and not nationalism. Now, it's true that both countries use nationalism as a tool uh, to push their wars, but the motivation came from socialism. So uh, it's, again, arguable, the idea that nationalism was the bad guy here. Uh, their form of socialism probably couldn't have done foreign conquest without nationalism, but the nationalism on its own didn't necessarily mean conquest would follow. So if we look at the United States, looking at the terms of nationalism, now, if you look at the government of the United States at the period of the Articles of Confederation, essentially you had two major groups in the country. One of these, they'd ultimately end up being called Federalists and Anti-Federalists, but actually a better descriptor of them would be Confederates and Nationalists. Confederates, or Anti-Federalists, uh, were content with the idea of a group of nation states, which is why we call our states states and not provinces, a group of nation states in a loose confederation primarily for defensive purposes. Whereas the Federalists or Nationalists envisioned a much greater superstate. They wanted to see an actual nation of the United States rather than a confederation of smaller states. Now there's some good arguments over which side was more right, and happy to have them, but ultimately the nationalists won, and we end up with a nation called the United States, or these United States. And the form of nationalism that the United States picked up in itself is rather benign, in my opinion. Uh, the general idea was if you came here and you lived within the parameters we'd set up, for the most part, you'd be left alone to either prosper or fail as your abilities would allow. Now, over time, this would change, and nationalism would be picked up as a tool by others to be used for other purposes. Nationalism's a way for a group of people within a borders to find common ground and work together. However, nationalism became twisted and with the advent of the progressive movement. The progressive movement the progressives themselves were ardent nationalists, even more nationalistic than the Federalists who created the country. In fact, I think probably the majority of the Federalists would have found the progressives' version of nationalism repulsive. But the progressives weren't happy with just a powerful nation state, because progressivism came from a religious background. It picks up dogma, that it evangelizes in a very religious manner. And one of the ideas that comes out of progressivism is this idea of Americanism, that there is an American system. And it's not just merely enough that the American system exists and gets better. That American system must be exported to the world. Obviously, we see the absolute height of this under Woodrow Wilson. Yeah, my favorite guy of all time, Woodrow Wilson. So he clearly wanted to export Americanism. He thought being at the peace conference of World War I would allow the brilliance of the United States to shine through, and that this Americanism would be spread through his League of Nations. Obviously, did not work out. And I would say, my opinion again, that all the bad uses of nationalism have been primarily used by the progressive part of the elites. Now, some of you who haven't been watching my videos will say, oh, you're blaming Democrats. No, there's progressives in the Republican Party too. If you see somebody on if you watch TV, I don't, but if you watch TV and you see somebody come on who says they're a Republican, and everyone on there saying, gee, they're a pretty good guy, they're level-headed, they're not as crazy as the rest of their party, those are the progressives, just in case you didn't know. Republicans refer to them as rhinos, but in fact, they've been a problematic part of the Republican Party for a long time. So, one of the reasons why I think a nation's nationalism has a place is that ultimately, when you break down, when you diminish government, when you bring it down to a less intrusive level, when the government does a lot less, ultimately people end up having to organize in some way. I know libertarians kind of like to think, oh, well, I'll just be living in a cabin in the woods and every other person will be living in a cabin in the woods someplace, and everything will be fine and dandy. Well, there's two problems with that. No individual lives entirely of their own means. You need other people to make things work. To make things work, you need some form of organization, and local is definitely a better way to go on things. And I do believe there is room for localized norms that are different from national norms. But for liberty to exist in the world as it is now, there does need to be some form of nation state to protect it. Now, mind you, ours has not been doing that particular job well. And that's, I think, our job is to get it to where that's the only thing it's capable of doing, is protecting the rights of the individual. Because if you look at the history of the world, anytime there is a small state in proximity to a larger state, the larger state eventually will start screwing around with the smaller state. Even if they don't invade outright, they will use their greater resources and money to attempt to influence, buy off the politicians, all the stuff you dislike about the United States in terms of what it does to other countries. If for some reason the federal government were suddenly eliminated, you would see a situation where the large countries of the world would start doing that exact same thing to us. And it would be highly effective because it would be a lot harder for these smaller entities to deal with the situation. Uh, a large nation state that has nearly infinite resources can buy off the most virtuous person. And so I do think we need nation states to protect liberty. I think a lot of these internationalist libertarians have kind of a borderline Marxist infection, whereas the Marxists believed that somehow their revolution would spread across the earth, that the government systems that they knew then would just disappear and would be supplanted by socialism and eventually dwindle down to the communist or anarchist state, has proved to be unworkable. It can't happen. It's so unworkable that it caused Marxist idea to splinter into hundreds of different ideas of how to try to implement it, because everyone came to the conclusion that Marxist way of seeing things wasn't ever going to happen. Libertarianism, obviously, I think is by far, I mean, Marxism is garbage. Libertarianism is a superior philosophy. However, I think the same impediments to Marxism spreading around the world and displacing the governments of the world are still there for libertarianism. Things aren't just going to suddenly disappear. I think libertarianism spreads when one nation state can show how libertarianism works. So I do think it's possible to be a libertarian nationalist. And I do use the definitions, just remind you of them real quick. The belief that nations will benefit from acting independently rather than collectively, emphasizing national rather than international goals. Okay? This definition itself is anti-collectivist. Libertarians are anti-collectivists. So this form of nationalism, this interpretation, I think is well within the bounds of libertarianism. And again, the belief that a particular culture or ethnic group constitutes a distinct people deserving of political self-determination, again, is something libertarians should be all in on. Now, if we look at what I was talking about, how nationalism gets hijacked as a tool for other forms of despotic behavior to be used in a bad way. Both Nazism and fascism and progressivism used nationalism as a tool. Nationalism by itself is benign. So I think part of the issue of making libertarianism work is also safeguarding nationalism so that it is in its benign form rather than being used as a tool to terrorize the neighborhood of the world. Okay. I hope that brought some new ideas to you. Do you agree with what I had to say? Do you think a libertarian can be a nationalist? Please tell me what you think in the comments below. Smash the like button if you liked what you saw. If you think somebody else might find this interesting, please share it with them. And if you like this, I do this a handful of times each week. please consider subscribing. I won't inundate you with a lot of material, but like I said, 4 to 5, maybe 6 times a week. Right. Well, thank you very much for spending time with me. Hope to see you again in a future video.